Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kelly Gallagher. I'm the academic dean, and I'm professor of energy and environmental policy at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. I'm delighted to be joined today by Francesca Giovannini, who is an adjunct assistant professor of international security here at Fletcher, and also the director of the Managing the Atom Project at the Belfer Center for Science and International Affairs at the Harvard Kennedy School. Thank you for joining us today, Francesca.
Thank you so much, Kelly, and good morning, everyone. Let me thank you, all your staff, and also the Fletcher School for organizing this session. I love Fletcher School. I love the students. I think, even in a moment like this, we are reminded of the key central role of law and diplomacy and multilateral engagement. And so I think your role is even more important, more pressing. Kelly, if you allow me, I just wanted to share a couple of thoughts and observations about the Ukrainian crisis and the many nuclear dimensions of this crisis. Some of you probably have read my latest piece on the bulletin, where I make the case that should the escalation continue and reach a hurting stalemate between the Russians and the Ukrainian forces, it is not implausible to think that President Putin will decide to use tactical nuclear weapons. But this is actually just one of the dimensions, nuclear dimensions of this crisis. And I just want to flesh out 3 points, in my view, in which the nuclear weapons play a role. The first one is how the nuclear question triggers the invasion of Ukraine. There are 2 main explanations that the Russians have given why invading Ukraine. The first one that Putin has repeated also yesterday is the argument that the Russian intelligence is making that in secret partnership with NATO and the United States, Ukraine was actually seeking the atomic weapons and therefore becoming an existential threat to Russian security. And to those of you on the video, I want to reassure you that there is no evidence to actually support this claim. The second is instead an argument the Russians have made over and over, which is the establishment and the setup of missile defense systems in Europe fundamentally undermine the credibility of the nuclear deterrence posture. These were fundamentally the 2 arguments why Russia decided from a security standpoint to invade Ukraine. Then there is the role of nuclear weapons in this crisis. And I would say there are 3 main roles that they play. The first one is the Russians have clearly escalated their rhetoric at the level that we have not seen in recent times. You have heard Secretary Lavrov talking about the third war, which is going to be the Third World War, which is going to be nuclear and destructive. You have seen President Putin putting on high alert its nuclear forces, and maybe in the Q&A we can also talk about this a little bit. And you have seen, for example, the clear target of nuclear power plants. Now, nuclear power plants are a civilian technology, and the Protocol 1 and 2 of the Geneva Convention explicitly forbid countries in war to attack nuclear power plants precisely because they can actually be very dangerous if, for example, detached from an electric grid that allows the stability of the reactor. So you see nuclear terror somehow entering into the narrative and the discourse of the Russians over and over. And finally, let me also mention how nuclear weapons will play a role in after the war, independently for how this works out. From now on, we are looking at a deep, long freeze in the negotiations and in diplomatic relations between the 2 largest nuclear arsenals in the world. By 2025, the only standing arms control agreement between the United States and Russia that right now forbids the 2 countries from deploying more than 1,500 nuclear weapons on their respective field is going to expire. And there is no prospect that any serious diplomatic talk will actually be initiated or even continue, in fact, from now on. So what you are looking at is the next 2 or 3 decades with fundamentally an unrestrained nuclear order and with no clear rules of engagement among major nuclear weapon states. Let me finish with this and happy to take your questions.
Wonderful. These are provocative, and thanks for jumping right in. The way we're going to run this fireside chat, so to speak, is I want to engage a little bit directly with Professor Giovannini in a little back and forth, and then we'll be opening it up for questions. And so if you have a question, you can raise your hand under the reaction function, or you can type it into the chat and we'll start accumulating a list of questions, and we'll be ending at 1:20 Eastern today. So Francesca, let's sort of step back a little bit. Just, you especially are so deep into the current crisis, but just, for the rest of us who haven't been focusing on this so earnestly, just historically, can you explain what happened to the nuclear weapons that were in Ukraine at the end of the Cold War when the Soviet Union dissolved? And what happened with those weapons that remained in Ukraine at that time?
Absolutely. Almost immediately after the breakdown of the Soviet Union, a very important initiative was launched actually in the United States, the Cooperative Threat Reduction Initiative. That was a spectacular and almost historically unmatched initiative, an unprecedented effort.
Otherwise known as the non-Lugar, right?
The non-Lugar agreement, exactly. Yeah. Where the United States, in partnership with, will then become the Russian Federations, will basically help the denuclearization of the key Soviet republics, then, on their way to become independent. But not only they help really dismantle the entire nuclear enterprise of many of these countries, but they also offer critical negative security assurances. In particular, the Clinton administration offered to both Belarus and Ukraine negative security assurances that should they decide, should they voluntarily give up their nuclear weapons on their territory, the United States will commit never to attack them with nuclear weapons as a first strike. Should they be should they enter into a confrontation? Similarly, the Russian Federation also entered into several security agreements with the former Soviet republics, in particular to incentivize them to give up their nuclear weapons and return the nuclear forces to the former Soviet Union. Some of these forces then, particularly nuclear warheads, were then dismantled, and some of this was actually taken by the United States, where there was a big program, the plutonium dismantlement program under the Clinton administration that really helped the former Soviet republics to get rid of the nuclear weapons. But it's important to remember that this was a voluntary acceptance, voluntary giving up of these weapons in exchange for specific security guarantees. That's how we basically are in this, in this situation today. So, and my understanding is Ukraine gave up all of its nuclear weapons at that time, correct? Correct.
Okay,
yes.
So given that Ukraine did do that, does it have any kind of deterrence capability today?
No, it has conventional capabilities.
Only
but it does not have. Right. Yes. No, it does not have any nuclear deterrence. So
is there? Upon what basis could Putin be arguing that Ukraine was seeking nuclear weapons? Is there any kernel or grain of truth to that claim?
Well, one thing that you can say is that Ukrainians continue to have a very extensive and very sophisticated civilian nuclear program. And, if you are paranoid, or if you really see Ukraine increasingly gravitating around the Western, the Western bloc, you might be thinking that at some point, should Ukraine, for example, enter into NATO, that wouldn't be a very difficult step for Ukraine then to either host nuclear weapons or to become one of the countries that support the nuclear enterprise. But I want to make clear that right now, as it is today, the International Atomic Energy Agency never reported any diversion of fissile material or technology in Ukraine towards military programs. So right now, there is no reason to believe that the argument is right.
All right. Well, you've mentioned two types of nuclear risks that are emerging due to the Russian invasion of Ukraine. First is obviously the risk of a nuclear strike, which, we titled this fireside chat as Thinking the Unthinkable. It truly seems unthinkable, but we really do need to think about it to understand what that would mean and think about how to avoid such a thing from transpiring. And then, of course, the second major risk, which became all too real last week was the risk of radiation leakage from civilian nuclear plants that have come under fire from Russian forces. So I'd like to try to take these one by one. On the risk of a nuclear strike, you recently wrote this fantastic piece in the Bulletin of Atomic Scientists that the possibility of a nuclear strike would increase if Russia perceived itself to be in a quote unquote herding stalemate situation. Can you talk about what is a herding stalemate situation and whether we're approaching it in Ukraine, in your judgment?
Yes, absolutely. So the herding stalemate is a concept that actually came out from the literature of conflict resolution and peace studies. And so the idea is at some point, the conflict between two parties reach an equilibrium where the costs are so enormous that they offset the benefits. And so one of the two parties at some point is necessary to capitulate and is brought to the table for negotiations. You can think about, for example, herding stalemate in the Iraq-Iran war, right? You had, the use of conventional capabilities. You used also of chemical weapons, and at some point, the two parties basically reach an equilibrium that doesn't go anywhere. And so this is the moment where you can actually have diplomatic efforts. In the case of Ukraine and the Russian Federation, it's very different. You have a country with chemical and nuclear capabilities versus a country that doesn't have them. So even if you have an equilibrium at the conventional level, the Russians will always be able to offset that equilibrium by launching either chemical or nuclear weapons. In that way, Ukraine will not be able to retaliate at that point. Now, my sense of the herding stalemate for the Russian is the following. I am concerned, Elizabeth Kelly, of this triumphalism over Ukraine. We all want Ukraine to win. What I urge people to think about is, wait a second, but what does victory means against the largest nuclear arsenal in the world? The Russians are already subjected to catastrophic and super costly consequences. So at this point, Putin has no reason to stop, right? He hasn't really achieved any of his strategic objectives. The longer the war drags on and the higher the cost and the risk for him to start seeing defections among his generals in particular. The oligarchs, to me, is a different kind of story. And so he needs at some point, he's pressed by time to escape that herding stalemate and basically offset it with a different type of capabilities. And the only way to do it is by using weapons of mass destruction. We have already seen that at conventional level, yes, the Russians are advancing, but to be clear, this is not a military campaign that is going according to plan, in spite of what Putin is saying, right? So this is a war that has become of endurance and entanglement, and the Russians at some point will have to break that entanglement and that equilibrium. So my concern becomes that at that point, for them, it will be less costly to use weapons of mass destruction rather than remaining in an equilibrium like this. And last point, we all want Ukraine to be able to defend themselves, but the longer we provide aid, the longer we provide military equipment, and the longer and the higher the risk that Putin will have to escalate further in order to break this impasse.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could argue we've already approached the herding stalemate already. And so then I think the question is there any reason to believe that Putin would exercise self-restraint before deploying, weapons of mass destruction? It seems to me plausible he might start with a chemical attack rather than going straight to a nuclear attack. And I would point to Syria as an example there as some precedent, which was, of course, the regime in Syria was backed by Putin. But what do you see are, like, just to argue against yourself for a second, where could we look at any precedent of self-restraint so far in this conflict on the part of Putin?
I think we can't see anything. And to be honest, Kelly, I am actually really in disagreement with people who argue that now Putin has gone mad. If you argue this, it means you haven't looked at what this man has done in the past 15 years. Let's take a look at the campaign he conducted in Chechnya over Grozny, which is now stand as the most distracted city in the world. The guy has not stopped for 1 second to bombard the city on his own territory. So to be honest, appealing on constraints, that seems to me really appealing to nothing right now. The constraint, unfortunately, that might appear increasingly the only option is for President Zelensky and his government to move into exile. In my view, if he can claim that he has changed the government, he has decapitated the government, he might claim a political victory, they might constrain him also on the military side. But he will continue until and unless this government is gone. And he has no reason not to, because he hasn't achieved any strategic objective that would justify this costly, catastrophe that is subjected to. On chemical weapons versus nuclear weapons, really interesting. I've debated a lot here on which one will use first. So, if ever, he has lots of familiarity with the chemical weapons. He supported the Assad regime in Syria. You are absolutely right. Now, the nuclear, however, gives you a very specific effect that I think chemical weapons doesn't, which is the demonstration effect that you are willing to break a taboo once and for all to demonstrate that your absolute resolve. And at that point, I think the international community will have to interrogate itself and really see whether there is even a potential to de-escalate this. If you're willing to use tactical nuclear weapons, you have demonstrated that you will never back down. In a way, the chemical weapons has less of a demonstration effect, if you want, terrible effects on the population, but I think politically, it's less of a message. We know that Putin, has been using chemical weapons also to assassinate its own political opponents. I think tactical nuclear weapons will be a further escalation. It will be an undeniable message of absolute resolve.
Very sobering. Let's move on to another sobering topic, which is on the civilian side, the civilian nuclear plants. So we saw very early in the invasion, Russian forces seized Chernobyl, an iconic, reminder of the risks of civilian nuclear power. And I think many around the world had, maybe forgotten even about Chernobyl and the disaster. I mean, it was many decades ago, 1986. And then, of course, last week, Russia seized by force the largest nuclear plant in Europe. I'm not sure I'm going to pronounce this correct, the Zaporizhzhia nuclear power facility, after firing on it and causing a fire to emerge. And this is a huge plant by any standard. It's a 6 gigawatt capacity plant. So enormous. And so there was, I guess I'm just trying to convey the high degree of risk related to firing on this plant. And it's now occupied by Russian forces. So how dangerous was it that Russian forces were firing on the plant? Do we need to be concerned about the spent fuel rods on site? And then it appears they're already going after other nuclear plants as well. So can you sort of talk about how to think about the risk in this domain?
Yes. So first of all, I mean, every single time you have nuclear technology in a country that is in war, yes, the risk, the catastrophic risk of a nuclear accident goes up exponentially. Now, I think we need to distinguish a little bit what is the rhetoric versus what the real risks are. So what you have seen, for example, in the attack on Thursday night, against the nuclear power plant, firing against a nuclear power plant doesn't mean anything. And it does not necessarily have specific impact on the safety of the nuclear power plant because of their reinforcement structure, the steel structure, and so on.
Amen. Right.
So this was mostly, I would say, nuclear terrorism. The idea that they can do something, but they know exactly what they were doing. This was not necessarily a risk or a catastrophic risk. But I tell you what, it is a catastrophic risk that, in my view, the Russians continue to somehow pretend not to listen to. The International Atomic Energy Agency has asked 2 things. One, you have to create a safety corridor of at least 20 miles around the nuclear power plant, partly to protect the towns that are adjacent to the nuclear power plant, but specifically to protect the civilian energy grid, the electricity grid that allows the water to continue to enter into a reactor and to cool down the temperature of the reactor. And that is also true for the spent fuel poles, where you basically maintain in safety the nuclear waste. So unless you have a corridor, a safety corridor, also includes the electricity grid, you are at risk of a nuclear explosion, for sure. Now, might not be 10 times Chernobyl, as the Ukrainians have said, but it still has serious risk. And then there is another risk, in my view, which is, as you have heard, the Russians now control the power plant, but they are also now, somehow mismanaging, if you want, the communication systems that allow the International Atomic Energy Agency to register the data from the nuclear power plant. Every single nuclear power plant in the world, under safeguards of the International Atomic Energy Agency, has remote sensing, so they can detect, for example, radioactive, release. Now, if you somehow dismantle those sensors, or if you obstruct the communication system, the International Atomic Energy Agency has no eyes on the plant. And so they've asked repeatedly to have international inspectors going into the plants to finally, ascertain that the safety of the plant is intact. Last point here, all the power reactors, this is true for the power plant you have mentioned, but the other three also that the Ukrainians have, all these power plants have active fuel in the reactors. And partly because even if they somehow, cease the activities in preparation for the war, the heat within the reactor is such that they can't remove the material yet. And so you have reactors that fundamentally still have a fission going on at this moment. So water is indispensable. That to me is nuclear terrorism, because the Russians know very well what that means. It's not so much, shooting at a nuclear power plant. It's the infrastructures that allow the run, the
Water supply, electricity supply.
Exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Yeah, yeah, we saw that as a real factor in Fukushima as well.
Exactly. And they know very well, what behaviors are tolerated and what not. One last point, Kelly, on this. You will see a marching towards all the nuclear power plants and nuclear facilities of Ukraine. They have occupied already 2 nuclear power plants. They're going after a third one, but they've also occupied nuclear research laboratories and institutes. That is in part because of the narrative of Putin that Ukraine was looking for the atomic bomb. And I wouldn't be surprised at some point if Putin comes out and said, by the way, we have found, these plans and these designs that demonstrate Ukraine was looking for the bomb. That would be part of the narrative that is constructed. So in that sense, I think they will try to occupy the entire nuclear enterprise for sure, and not only the power plants.
All right, I'm going to ask one more question, and then I'm going to turn the floor over to Arik to moderate discussion. So everyone start preparing your questions. Francesca, conventionally, academics or scholars think of risk as being a function of the potential hazard times the probability of that hazard occurring. So we've talked a lot about the hazard, 2 types of hazards, right? The hazard of a nuclear strike in Ukraine or elsewhere, I guess, and then also the hazard of a nuclear reactor leak. And up until now, right, we've always thought that the probability was very low in both cases. These were well-maintained plants. They were under good observation from the IAEA. We also thought, as you called it, there was a strong taboo against a nuclear strike. And so I want to ask you this hard question, could you put a probability now on each type of hazard, the strike or and nobody's going to hold you to it, but just to help us understand sort of how you think the probabilities have changed from very low, to whatever in each case now.
I think, to be honest, we disagree internally about this, these probabilities, but I would say, I think it's in the range of 35 to 40%. I just don't see
for each type. Each type of
yes, because to be honest, Kelly, he might decide, look, tactical nuclear weapons might not necessarily be the right strategy, but if you go after, or you somehow accidentally, destroy an electric grid around a nuclear power plant, you know exactly what you're going to get, right? So it's either nuclear terrorism or intentional attacks. For me, it becomes very difficult to believe that he will back down without a decisive victory at this point. So yes, I think you are absolutely right, and this is where I have to say, even the theories of nuclear deterrence right now are not holding, in this situation. I mean, we don't actually know how a nuclear weapon state will fight, and until, at what cost against a non-nuclear weapon state. I tell you, there is an historical precedence for this, which is very interesting. President Eisenhower during the Korean War, declassified information said that, he was entertaining the possibility, but he backed down because, he had the possibility, of inflicting cost, not decisive victory, but inflicting enough cost with conventional that for the Americans were sufficient, right? But here it's not the same situation. For him, it's not only inflicting cost. It could be that his goal right now is no longer just decapitating the government, but it is destroying Ukraine and making sure that Ukraine will never be able to stand up again for the next 10 to 15 years. And at the point, I don't think he's able to do this only with conventional capabilities. So the probability of using weapons of mass destruction for me is very, very high.
Okay, let me now introduce Arik Burakovsky, who is the Assistant Director of Fletcher's Eurasia and Russia program. Arik, let me turn the floor over to you to moderate audience discussion and Q&A.
Great. Thank you, Kelly, and thank you to Francesca for the excellent introductory remarks and for the fireside chat with Kelly. I have just two clarifying questions before we turn it over to the audience, and I would encourage the audience either to ask a question in the chat or to raise their hand on Zoom, and I would be happy to call on you and turn on your audio and video to be able to ask the question. So two questions from me. The first has to do with the Budapest Memorandum. I think that there's been a debate about whether Ukraine would have been able to hold on to a nuclear deterrent or whether this was simply a bargaining chip at the time. My understanding is that, in fact, the United States wanted nuclear weapons to be removed from Ukraine because they were worried about some of the risks involved. Ukraine would not have been able to operate them properly or modernize them. In fact, they were centrally controlled out of Moscow. So I'm wondering if you could speak to that. And the second question has to do with whether there's any strategic reasoning for Russia to take over nuclear power plants in Ukraine. Ukraine depends on nuclear power. I think 20% of its energy comes from nuclear power. And so beyond just the narrative that Russia has that Ukraine is developing nuclear weapons and the nuclear terrorism that you've referred to, is there any strategic purpose in actually taking over these nuclear power plants?
Yeah. Hi, Arik. Thank you so much for the questions and excellent questions. Yes, I think you're absolutely right. The Clinton administration really wanted Ukraine to give up the nuclear weapons. And remember, it was the 90s, right? So the United States already in their nuclear posture review were actually downgrading the role of nuclear weapons themselves. There was this idea of maybe shifting towards what was called at the time defense dominance, this idea of having less risk on the offensive side, but in basically creating more defensive capabilities, still believing, that the unipolar moment would have lasted at least for a long time. And for sure, the idea was, and remember, Clinton had great relations with Russia at that time, right? They really wanted to help them. The idea was, at some point, there was even a discussion that, Russia would have entered into NATO. So there was an idea that appeased Russia in making sure that we reduce the real risks of nuclear weapons in countries that, quite frankly, economically could not secure them, nor they could guarantee a command and control structure that, quite frankly, was reliable, was the best way to do it. So, but it was the 90s, right? And that was really the narrative of the Clinton administration coming into power. There were also, in fact, several security guarantees that the United States has never given, historically after that. This idea that they would not attack, non-nuclear weapon states with nuclear weapons. Now we have way more opaque strategy, if you want. But the 90s was really way more openness. The idea that nuclear weapons need to take a marginal role in defense, both in Europe and in the United States. So you're absolutely right. The Americans never wanted Ukraine to keep the weapons. And there was also really an issue of safety, quite frankly, that they were extremely concerned about, for sure. There was, in fact, if you remember, Sig Hacker, some of our best scientists travel like for days and months to Kazakhstan to close the nuclear test site at Semipalatinsk and the former Soviet Union to make sure the plutonium was removed. I mean, there were serious concerns over safety, and also, quite frankly, the possibility of having this material getting lost, or maybe ending up in the wrong hands. So there were a lot of concerns that were not strategic security concerns, that were more about safety, quite frankly. Absolutely, you're right. What is the strategic implication of taking over a nuclear power plant? Yes, in fact, I think my most recent reading about this is I think Ukraine actually electricity relies almost for 40% on nuclear power plants. There is no doubt that this is a way somehow to further try to break the resistance of the Ukrainians. One thing that actually, Arik, your question gives me a possibility of address is this one. I've been asked a few times whether taking over these nuclear power plants is also because the Russians can put their hands on fissile material for more bombs. The answer is no. The Russians have plenty of plutonium and uranium. They don't need to take it from Ukraine. So in that way, it's not necessarily a calculation of more bombs.
Great. So our first question comes from Adam Banker, and he asks, there are reports of dissent in the FSB over the decision to invade. Is there any indication of a similar rift in the Russian military? And could any dissent lead to the use of a nuclear weapon?
This is such an important question, Adam, and one that I've actually pondered a lot. So first of all, I'm actually rereading a book that I find really interesting. The Teda Skocpol talks about revolutionary states, right? And she talks about the Russians and the Iranian states or the French states are really revolutionary. And so one of the big questions I'm asked these days is it possible to think about the revolution in Russia? Now, I think personally on the social level, no. But I think one thing that might accelerate Putin's calculation in war is precisely what you're talking about, the defections among his generals. We're going after the oligarchs, but to be honest, since 2009, Putin has shifted the balance of power within Russia from the oligarchs to his own people from more the military ranks, right? So yes, the oligarchs still holds a lot of economic power, but his own entourage is more of the military and security establishment. Should he see defection or resistance from his generals, especially General Garimov, who is actually in charge of the strategic forces of Russia, that would change his calculations very, very quickly. And this is exactly what I'm fear, which is if he perceives that the generals are now losing the morale with the determination to win, he might decide to accelerate until he gets a decisive victory. So in a way, I hope that happens. And on the other hand, I think it's going to be quite catastrophic. So I think he's looking at his generals very, very clearly. You have seen also in this ridiculous National Security Council he convened, right, the belittling of his own head of intelligence forces. And partly he was belittling him because in Putin's mind, he wasn't offering a more determined and resolved, declaration of war against Ukraine. So you will start seeing probably some changes at the heads of critical military infrastructures. My understanding also from talking to a few experts here is also that he's trying to tilt the balance by now sending in mercenaries. So these are very, very qualified special forces that report directly to him. So you will see an entanglement across many different Russian forces that might be really interesting. But the defection of the generals, to me, might make him even more dangerous.
I just want to jump in because I think that the question was also not just about defection, but do you think there's any likelihood that they would fail or refuse to execute the order to use nuclear weapons?
So just to clarify, the launch of a nuclear weapon in the Russian establishment is actually done by 3 people. So he can order it, but he has 2 ministries that actually have to authorize. Together with them, he has the system of the 3 keys, right? So it is possible that generals might decide not to. But to be honest, Kelly, in my view, he is already putting under surveillance all generals. He will remove, decapitate any general that might actually prove, not enough determined about this. You've seen this with the intelligence forces. I think Garimov right now is very silent. He hasn't released any declaration. You could think that they will fail to comply, but before you get there, in my view, it will certainly try to change the leadership of the generals.
So I'm going to group a couple of questions. One is about what the use of a nuclear weapon might actually look like on the ground. What are the potential targets? And would this only be a risk to Ukraine, or is there a risk to NATO members such as Poland and the Baltic states?
It depends very much. So the type of target, most likely is going to target something symbolic that will make sure to send an undeniable message. Paradoxically, I have to tell you, I doubt he will actually decide to target Kiev, because let's remember that in the history of Soviet Union and also the Russian Empire beforehand, Kiev is really considered the capital of the Russian motherhood, right? The civilization. So I don't think Kiev is the target he has in mind. You can think about like secondary or third targets, like second largest city, or for example, small cities in the inner land that might not necessarily, he might not be able to capture through conventional capabilities, but launching yet very important political message. What would he do? Nobody knows, because to be honest, the yield of any nuclear weapon is classified. So we actually don't know, the type of field that you'd probably go for. But my argument is it will choose probably something very limited that can be contained, and he would probably launch it towards, the western side of Ukraine that would actually avoid, of course, exposing the Russian territory. You might think there will be, for sure. I mean, I don't know the type of field, but there will be certain radioactive release, depending on how low it will decide to launch it, whether it will go towards the ground or will launch up in the air. It's very difficult to make any estimate, but you will have, for sure, a release of radioactive material. This will also force the population to depopulate very quickly centers. You will also, of course, dismantle your water pipelines that will become completely unusable. So you'll have catastrophic consequences on the agriculture, and consequences would stay for decades. Will Poland be exposed? Yet it depends on the yield. It might. I think it's most likely that Poland is going to be hit than the Russian Federation. So they will probably do an operation, if at all, towards the western side of the country. It's horrifying just talking about these things, because I actually want to mention one thing, especially to the students here. Nuclear weapons are not and should never be considered conventional capabilities. So the fact that we are thinking now about launching nuclear weapons, it's already, beyond any precedence. And I want to urge you guys not to think about these weapons as conventional, because this is precisely why there is a nuclear taboo. Yes, some have argued that they are usable, but the deterrence theories that people like me have always advocated for, no, these are simply political weapons. It should never be considered in a warfare.
So I know we would be in uncharted territory, and it is horrifying to think about it, but what might a Western response look like to Russia breaking the nuclear taboo?
So they've asked me this question many times, and especially the Europeans do not want to accept this. If he breaks the nuclear taboo, in my view, Arik, we will be doing exactly what we are doing right now. We have already said we were not going to intervene in a conventional war, let alone if you have dropping of tactical nuclear weapons or chemical, for that matter. I mean, look what was our response, with the chemical weapons in Syria, right? The famous red threshold of Obama. So when you touch weapons of mass destruction, this is really, in my view, the key difference between democracies and authoritarian regimes. The threshold of risk is very, very different. You will not expose NATO or the United States and their societies to a potential escalation of conflict. So I'm sorry to say this, but I feel like, and that's why it becomes really, really plausible, because in my view, there will be no military response. We are not going to get entangled into a military confrontation because Putin used chemical or tactical nuclear weapons. I tell you what is going to change, in my view. In my view, it's going to change big time the position of China that right now has been really on the sidelines. Fantastic, calls for ceasefire and humanitarian aid, but the Chinese have fundamentally stayed very much on the sideline. That to me would change very, very quickly. The calculations for the Chinese, for the Indians, for the Central Asian republics, countries that have stayed on the sideline, tried their best, but that would bring them really into a serious engagement. And you will see massive retaliation economically, socially, politically against Russia. In that sense, I think that will change the calculation, but not on the military front.
So I think that gets to the question from Perry Boyle, talking about engagement versus isolation of autocracies. Does it make sense to continue to engage China and Russia on these nuclear issues?
Yeah, this is a very difficult and complex question, and I agree this is the key question today, right? If you look at, for example, what we've done with Russia, we can say that we have tried to appease Putin exactly as we've done with Hitler, and appeasement has not worked out. On the other hand, if you had isolated them, counterfactual, maybe they would have been even worse off, right? Maybe would have already been in a confrontation at some point. I tell you what I find problematic today. I think it's very dangerous also in our own democracies to cast this century as the clash between democracies and authoritarian regimes. I find it really oversimplifying the reality of the situation. And I find it also creating a lot of big tensions among societies. So look what is happening right now with Ukraine, right? Biden cast it as democracies against authoritarian regimes, and the society responds with international coalitions of fighters, international coalitions for helping Ukraine, and so on and so forth. So societies get mobilized in fighting this war. That puts a lot of pressure on democracies then to intervene even further, right? To make sure that we are at the front line of conflict, therefore risking a further escalation. To me, the situation of the 21st century is really more complicated than this. It is about finding areas where we really can cooperate and really try independently from the type of regime. And the Chinese have a lot of areas where we should cooperate together, a lot of deep interest in very existential risk, to be honest. The climate change is one, but also let's not forget that right now, the situation in Ukraine is quite devastating for China as well. It has a major hit on the global economy. And for a country that basically relies entirely on the global economy to function, this is a catastrophic outcome. So for me, the point is less to engage authoritarian regimes, but it's trying to create areas for cooperation across multiple coalitions of states. And one thing I wanted to mention is a few years ago, there was this discussion about network governance. So the idea of moving away from these rigid international organizations and try to understand what are the big questions that countries need to work together on. So you can think about the network of countries that work on environmental issues and climate change. Another one that looks more at water security or food security. So I think the structure of multilateral diplomacy needs to change based on what is happening with Ukraine and based also on type of challenges we need to face moving forward. Should we appease China? I actually want to mention also something I believe strongly. I don't think that China is looking with great pleasure over Ukraine because of Taiwan. I think Taiwan is a way more complicated issue than that. Chinese will not do it in this way. So I think with China, there are areas for cooperation. We should look very actively for them.
Great. So this next question comes from Tatiana Androsov, asking about more historical analysis. Has the perception of the risk of the use or the results of the use of nuclear weapons decreased over the last few decades? And has it, in some sense, reemerged now with the current war in Ukraine?
Tatiana, you have no idea how welcome this question is, because I want to congratulate Kelly and the Fletcher School for investing in a class that talks about nuclear weapons, because believe it or not, for 20 years, universities have basically eliminated nuclear studies in a way, because the idea was, well, these are a relic of the past, right? Yes, we still have nuclear weapons, but fundamentally, countries will fight with other means, right? Cyber is artificial intelligence and so on and so forth. Now, yes, the risks and the perception of risks, but even the knowledge of the existence of nuclear weapons has gone down dramatically in the past 30 years. There were some surveys done recently with many American students, asking them, how many nuclear weapons do you think the United States has, and how many nuclear weapons should Americans have? And the answer was, America has 200 and they should have 100. Now, Americans has over 6,000 nuclear weapons, right? And we're still modernizing and expanding. So the perception of what we have is completely detached from reality. So what was the problem? The problem was that after the end of the Cold War, fundamentally, these nukes remain around, but the attention of both policymakers, the universities, scholars, somehow diverted towards more pressing issues. The 90s was, if you remember, the civil wars, the breakdown of Yugoslavia, Rwanda, the genocide. Then 9/11, right? So there was a decade about terrorism, counterterrorism. Then you have, 2010 onwards, the rise of China. And so we have been very distracted, never really considering that nuclear weapons remained in the background. And in my view, casting a very long shadow. Now, as I said to my students in class, nuclear weapons do not play a role in every single crisis, right? And there are many issues, from climate change to development, where nuclear weapons play zero role. When you have strategic interactions, strategic, confrontations, nuclear weapons remain there and they play a fundamental role. And so from the security standpoint, the fact that we now have lost decades of training of new generation of scholars is really, really, really dangerous. Absolutely.
So I think we have time for just one more question, but I'm not seeing any more in the chat. Does anyone have another question? And if not, I can turn it over to Kelly. Oh, it looks like Ian Johnstone has a question.
Hi, sorry about that. Hi, Francesca. So maybe this is a good way to conclude. You pointed out that deterrence doesn't seem to be working, that there's a 35 to 40% chance of nuclear strike or some other use of nuclear material in a destructive way. So I guess the question is not what to do if it happens, but elaborate a bit on what you think the US and Europe can do to minimize the chances of it happening in the first place at this stage. And you began by talking about an off-ramp for Putin. Have you any further thoughts about that?
Yes, Ian, thank you so much, and so great to see you. Actually, I wanted to take your class on. We haven't really talked about international law, which plays a fundamental role, right? So threatening countries with nuclear weapons, or even the use of nuclear weapons in some instances, it would be in this case, is a catastrophic violation of the law of armed conflict. What to do right now? I would say a couple of things. First one is a flawless coordination among NATO allies and the United States. And when I talk about flawless, I mean we should avoid at all cost for countries to start applying measures or sanctions or punitive actions without consulting with the alliance. Because what, of course, is happening right now is the Russians are now looking into escalation scenarios, right? And so, for example, the declaration of Turkey that they were going to close the Bosphorus or impose like almost a naval blockade, I found this really, really dangerous. And so no unilateral actions of any sort. I think that there will be a point here, and I'm talking to the Pentagon right now. I mean, all these discussions about providing jets, Ukraine, and maybe doing an exchange with Poland. You've seen the Polish say very clearly there is not going to be an agreement, on this front. I at some point we need to really seriously think what is going to be the threshold that tilts the balance. And in my view, we have not been very serious about discussing this. are these actions now all worth it? Because one way is to do it with economic sanctions. Another, when you actually provide fresh weapons, new technologies that continue to perpetuate this fighting. And it's a very big humanitarian dilemma, because partly we do want democracy to win, and this is an unjust war, but on the other, we also don't want to get entangled. So for me, two things. One is absolute coordination of any maneuvering, and B, a serious discussion right now about how much is this worth it. I do know, for example, there are serious discussions right now to see whether the government of Zelensky should go in exile. And as you can see here, is an attempt to de-escalate and find some off-ramps for Putin. Last point, the Pentagon has done a fantastic job last week here in response to Putin's putting on high alert his nuclear forces. They've done two de-escalation moves. One, they've said that they are not going to alter the alert system of their nuclear forces, and B, they've canceled a Minuteman exercise that could have been really escalatory for the Russians. These are measures that need to be taken consistently. The military is not the way to solve this. So this I would say are the three things for me.
Francesca, thank you so much for your extremely sobering remarks. I think it's very important to help open people's eyes to the risks that we're facing right now. They're serious and they're real. And it's the first time in, almost a generation that we've had to seriously think about these risks, as you've rightly pointed out. So I'd like to also thank everyone who took time out of their day to sit and think about these issues together with us. Really appreciate your time and interest. And with that, we'll close the session, and I wish you all a great day.
Thank you so much. I love you, Fletcher. See you Thursday.
Thank you, Francesca.
So.